Yesterday, President Biden signed a new executive order directing the Department of Health and Human Services to release guidance on how states can expand access to comprehensive health care for LGBT patients. The order, among other provisions, also empowers the Department of Health and Human Services to ensure federal health programming does not fund conversion therapy. This move from the White House comes after conservative leaders across several states have targeted trans people, and in particular trans children's, access to gender-affirming health care like hormone blockers and reassignment surgery.
Just last week, a Texas judge blocked the state's child abuse investigations into parents who consented to gender-affirming care for their trans children. According to the Texas Tribune, cases have been opened against at least 9 families so far. Joining us now to weigh in is our rising panel. Jordan Chariton is a journalist and CEO of Status Coup News, and Emily Jashinsky is culture editor at the Federalist and co-host of Rising Fridays. Welcome to you both.
Morning.
Yeah, good morning. So, Emily, I think, I know where you stand on a lot of these issues, and I have some similar concerns certainly about doing irreversible procedures with young kids. I think they shouldn't necessarily be affirmed in every choice they make or every idea they have, and I want to make sure it's very thoroughly vetted before they go forward with anything. I do not love at all the kind of investigations into families for this kind of thing because, Child Protective Services is a nightmare and actually can be deployed just as easily against conservative parents for doing things that progressive people in the state don't like. So are you familiar with what's going on in that area of it?
Well, actually, Child Protective Services has, in fact, been used in the other direction towards parents who have not pursued gender-affirming care in different states. I think the last one I was reading about was in Washington State. So you're right about that, Robbie. But what you're talking about gets to, and that as you're reading the introduction, it's just it clearly shows how sad it is that these children have been caught in a political tug of war, and it's with laws and executive orders and everything, like one being layered on top of the other that goes back of this and this and this. I think it's like incredibly sad. The New York Times had a very long essay just yesterday. Actually, it was more of an investigation than an essay.
Yeah, it was a great piece.
Yeah, it talked to a lot of people who have provided care for people who identify as transgender in their childhood over the years, like over, in some cases, a 20-year span, and how certain things have changed, how certain things have stayed the same. And so I think it's inevitable that politics got involved in this, but we're definitely getting to a place where neither side is putting the children first and the interests of the children first as the political football just sort of gets kicked around.
Jordan, is it true that it is a matter of course that this become politicized, that it's expected that this has become politicized? Because I gotta confess that every time I find myself talking about the particular needs of a very narrow portion of the population in the middle of a crisis at the level of the crisis we're currently in, I'm never not surprised that so much of our national conversation and so much of the political polarization is happening along the lines of what is happening to the transgender community. It does feel like this executive order is responsive, is reactive to the enormous amount of attention that the right has decided to pay to transgender kids in particular. What do you make of this order, and how do you think the liberals, then the broad left, should be responding to the focus on trans kids in particular?
Well, I'm glad to see President Biden knows how to sign an executive order, so let's pressure him to do it on economic issues as well. But I was in Florida. I covered what they're calling the parental rights bill, more commonly known as the Don't Say Gay bill. And I think what you're seeing, honestly, is what conservatives and Republicans have always done, which is while they're screwing their own voters economically, they dangle some culture wars over them. I mean, in Florida in particular, inflation is higher than the national average. Property taxes are through the roof. DeSantis has given $624 million in tax breaks to wealthy corporations recently. I mean, I could go down the list of economically the problems in Florida. Housing is out of control, rent is out of control. But DeSantis, to play to a national base, is targeting LGBTQ, transgender, math textbooks. I mean, it's kind of crazy in terms of the economic crisis, what DeSantis and other Republican governors like him, Greg Abbott as well in Texas, are doing. That doesn't mean there aren't legitimate concerns. How young should a child be allowed to start these transitioning services? I think there's legitimate discussion with that, but how transgender people have become kind of just the sacrificial lambs for the culture wars, I have no idea. But I've met a lot of them, and a lot of them are suicidal, extremely depressed because of all of this.
Well, can I jump in there?
Go ahead, Emily.
I just want to jump in there because I think it's really important to say that actually also goes in the other direction. This is a culture war issue that the left dangles to distract from their terrible economic policies as well. And in the case of the right, they're responding. They're on defense to exactly what Jordan just mentioned, which is that there are legitimate concerns to be had. That doesn't mean the right isn't going to overreach in certain instances for the sake of political expediency, sure. But it's also on this issue, not just the right. I've talked to parents in my reporting who are fully supportive of the LGBT cause, but whose child was caught in a really sad situation personally, and they want, for instance, the right to know what's happening at the school with their child, and that's what some of these bills target. Again, that's not to say that there's going to be no overreach, but I really think it's important that the right is responding to culture war issues that are often very much ginned up by policies on the left, and that's what I think you can also see with this executive order by President Biden, which again, if you come from the perspective of the left on trans children issues, you might say that this is a substantive action. But at the same time, it is a response for the sake of politics, too. And so I don't think it's totally fair to just put this on the right for dangling a culture war issue in front of their voters to distract from economics. I think the left is doing the same thing in the other direction.
What is the federal or state? Can you point to the federal or state policy that the left has pursued with respect to gender-affirming care or transitions that might have sparked all of this? Was there a specific policy?
Yeah, absolutely. The Obama administration did this via a Dear Colleague letter in the last year.
That wasn't a policy, Emily. That was to your point, a letter that was recommending.
No, it's a policy.
It's a policy. How's it not a policy?
It's absolutely a policy.
There's a big difference between
federal funds. Federal funds were then hanging on whether or not you complied with the Dear Colleague letter. That's the problem with Dear Colleague letters.
That letter, if I recall correctly, had to do with recommendations to colleges and how they handled.
No.
That's the 2011 one.
The 2016 one,
right.
It was in May. It was issued by John King, and it said that you had to read gender identity into Title IX.
Right.
And so that was a policy you had to, in order to receive federal funds as a school, you had to comply with the reading of gender identity into Title IX. And that's actually really what started a lot of these battles just in 2016,
right.
Because schools were sort of racing to comply with it. And then you had states either trying to catch up or trying to do their own thing because the federal policy, and Robbie, you covered this a lot at the time, because the federal policy came down via the letter that sort of skirted the legislative. It was basically doing what the Equality Act would have done, but it did it via just a letter from the Secretary of Education at the time, and that actually contributed to a lot of the confusion.
Exactly. It's disguised as mere guidance, but because it carries the force of the executive branch, no school wants to go up against it.
What does it mean to read gender identity into Title IX?
That you conflate sex with gender identity. So when you're reading on the basis of sex, you also have to read on the basis of gender identity, which I think, it sounds like one thing, but the implications for it, especially in like different localities with locker rooms and bathrooms and sports teams, were extremely confusing. And that's how a lot of these battles or these skirmishes in the culture war, I think, ended up popping up because there was confusion. And then the kids got used as political footballs because there was this, the federal funding, which is really important to a lot of schools, that was being dangled over them in order to comply. They had to sort of figure out what that meant and figure out how they could comply. And it just sparked a lot on the state level.
It's a 50-year-old law. It's actually turned 50 this month, I think, or is about to turn 50, that clearly was never designed to cover the kind of cases we're talking about now. So administrators are just kind of making it. I mean, they have a vision of how they would like the law to be, and they're just kind of declaring it. And it is actually at the level of federal battle over this. instead of having any kind of legislator work through it.
Right.
So I know, Jordan, that you mentioned earlier that you were talking specifically to trans students in Florida. What were you being told there? I thought we had a clip that we were going to play from that. Okay, let's take a listen.
Like, everyone I know is suicidal. I'm on antidepressants. Everyone I know has, like, it's terrible.
I have a bag of medication.
Yeah, exactly. Every single person is either on antidepressants or, like, extremely suicidal. And that's where we're at right now. Florida already has the highest LGBTQ suicide rate of any state. And queer teens are 4 times more likely to commit suicide. And they know that, because I said that and I was one of hundreds that said that, testifying in the Senate and the House of Representatives. I went door to door talking to senators and representatives, Republican and Democrat, telling them these statistics and telling them personal stories. They heard me, they listened, and they voted for it anyways, because they know what they're doing and they are trying to kill us.
So Emily, where's the balance there? There's a lot of conversation about what's best for the kid, and there does seem to be some inconsistency with respect to kind of a conservative approach that says, well, we'll leave things to families, we'll leave things to individuals to decide, and this interference via law from the state. You know, given what he's saying about the highest suicide rates in Florida specifically, and perhaps in other localities where there are these targeted bills to the LGBT community, how do you balance the perceived interests of kids versus this idea that they need to be protected from the decisions being made with their families and their doctors?
Yeah, that clip is just heartbreaking. And actually, the Heritage Foundation, love it or hate it, released a study this week that I think is pretty good. It's not definitive, but it's evidence in the other direction that there's a correlation between states that have allowed over the years some of these puberty blocking treatments to be in effect and the teen suicide rate. And so it's not, again, I don't think it's definitive or conclusive, but I will say that there is evidence in both directions of that. It is like not conclusive that the suicide rate spikes if the gender-affirming care is not provided, and it is not conclusive that it won't go in the other direction either. So all that said, I think that's part of what's really, really difficult about this subject is that it's really like these treatments are really new, and it's hard to have long-term studies on the effects of children, and so inevitably children end up being used as guinea pigs before their own brains are developed, before their bodies are fully developed. And so the bottom line is, I want what's best for children, and I don't care about the politics or the ideology. If the study shows that this is best for children, absolutely. If I was presented with evidence that this is going to prevent suicide and conclusive evidence over long term, my goodness, yeah, let's prevent suicide. But it is hard when you don't have long-term research. But I think that's a great clip from Jordan, and it's hard to watch and hard to listen to those very sad stories.
Right, especially we're seeing the. We want to, Jordan, want to get your response. I think Emily's right that we're seeing, higher teen, or at least in the data, we're seeing higher rates of teen depression and suicide along the same kind of time period that certainly you might think that we should be more affirming of trans youth, of LGBT youth. But I have to think we're more affirming of it today than we were 20 years ago, and yet the depression and suicide rates are actually getting worse among this cohort.
Yeah, well, one thing you didn't see is their classmates were heckling them and bullying them while I was doing the interview. That's another thing. I don't know if it's in Heritage study. I mean, LGBTQ kids are bullied, including trans kids. A lot of them are thrown out of their homes. One of the kids I was interviewing was basically homeless because their parents didn't accept them. So there's a lot of factors that go into LGBTQ depression, suicidal ideation, separate from puberty blockers, the medical component of transitioning. That's just societal. And frankly, I totally agree with Emily. Of course, the Democrats would much rather send fundraisers out on Roe v. Wade, attacks on LGBTQ people, than the fundraisers they're doing in wine caves. But they are not passing laws to block healthcare for transitioning. They're not passing laws to basically put a gag order so those children can't speak about their weekend picnic if they have two dads or two moms. So, in terms of the extreme of what's going on, it's Republican governors that are targeting these kids. I agree that the Democrats are glad to talk about this rather than their neoliberal policies that are crushing people. But people should realize that, it's these teenagers and young kids that are the sacrificial lambs. It's hard enough being a teenager. I had depression when I was a teenager, not dealing with this. So I really think we should stop with this culture war attacking LGBTQ people, transgender people, leave it to families, and, leave it to experts, not government officials, on what is the appropriate age that kids should be able to be even entertaining transitioning and those kind of things.
Okay. I can get on board with that. Jordan, Emily, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks.
And we'll have more Rising right after this.